Okay, well, first of all, I want to say thank you for inviting me to give this keynote presentation. It's a great honor. I'm going to be talking today about ecology, spirituality, and the paranormal, enchanted nature and subtle activism. And I hope over the course of the presentation, it'll become clear how these disparate or seemingly unconnected themes, the paranormal, spirituality, and ecology, are actually quite closely related. And hopefully we'll see how an understanding of this or an awareness of this might be able to lead us into subtle forms of activism, but the things that can actually make a difference. Okay, so that's the plan anyway. For my own benefit, I've split the lecture into 3 parts. The first part will deal with these key concepts of ecology, spirituality, and the paranormal. So I'll explain a little bit about those terms, why I like to use them, and how I think they're connected. The second part will deal with this concept of the other than human, the idea that there are, other than human things out there. And then the third part will look at my concept of psychodiversity, sort of as it's the flip side of biodiversity in a way, or not the flip side, the parallel side of biodiversity, and how an awareness of this, like I was saying, can help us to actually do something positive in the world. And then I'll conclude. I'll just say that these ideas are all kind of related to, and we explore them in this book, Greening the Paranormal, which I released a couple of years ago now, with a whole host of interesting contributors talking on all of these intersections and from different disciplinary backgrounds, different contexts. And we also explore these ideas on the MA in Ecology and Spirituality, the University of Wales Trinity St David and the Sophia Centre. So if you're interested, you can check these things out for a little bit more. But these ideas that I'm going to talk about now are kind of intrinsic to the explorations in the MA and in the book Greening the Paranormal. So to begin, part 1, ecology, spirituality, and the paranormal. What are these things? Well, the word ecology comes from the Greek, as a lot of these terms do, oikos, meaning house or home, and logos, which is generally used today to refer to sort of like the study of, or a discourse around, or a conversation about something. So ecology then is the study of, or a discourse around our home. But obviously it's an understanding of the home that encompasses more than just our physical house, the buildings that we live in, or our villages and communities. It's the home understood in its broadest sense as really the planet Earth, the whole. This is our home. And we can think of ecology as it began to emerge as a science, as the science of the relationships between living organisms and their environment. And this is an interesting relationship because increasingly the environment and life seem to be in a reciprocal relationship with each other. It's not that organisms are living at the whim of the environment, or that organisms are purely creating the environment. It's a mixture, a combination of both. It's a very interesting field of research. And we can take it back as far as the ancient Greeks and Aristotle, but we could also say that having an understanding, a scientific understanding of ecology, the plants and animals that exist around us in the environment, would also have been essential for our ancient ancestors, hunter-gatherers, and all of those kinds of things. In order to survive, we have to be able to understand our environment. So human beings are natural ecologists, I would say. But as a scientific discipline, it didn't really emerge or crystallize until the 19th century, and really kind of solidified in the 20th century. So it's quite a young science, a young field of research, but it's very important. And for quite a young science, it's had quite a major ripple effect throughout Western culture, which is quite interesting. And broadly speaking, ecology, as it's performed in universities and taught, is a positivistic science. So it's empirical, objective. It's one of the hard sciences, and it's in the realm of biology, chemistry, physics, and that kind of thing. And there's very little room in biology and ecology for anything like the supernatural or the spiritual. There's been a big tendency to push against that in biology. But obviously there have also been strands within biology of vitalism and that kind of thing that have, continued to flow. We can also talk about cultural ecologies. So there is the science of ecology, and I think we could in fact say that the science of ecology, Western science of ecology, is itself a cultural ecology. So the anthropologist Frake, he says that ecology is the study of the workings of ecosystems. This is the science of ecology that we've just been talking about, of the behavioral interdependence of different kinds of organisms with respect to one another and to their non-biotic environment. And cultural ecology is the study of the role of culture as a dynamic component of any ecosystem of which humans are a part. So what he's saying here is that our cultures are as much embedded in ecology as anything else. And because of that, our cultural ideas, beliefs, and things like that also have an impact on the environment around us. They inform the way that we live in the world. So different cultural systems have got different interpretations of the facts of, ecology, of the natural environment around us. And these different interpretations lead to different modes of behavior, different ways of living. Okay. We could even say that there are different cultures, or maybe even subcultures within the science of ecology. Maybe think of these as paradigms. And these are revealed by key debates within ecological science, debates between people who prefer to look at the bigger picture, a holistic view, and scientists who prefer to look at a reductionist perspective, for example. Okay, so there are many different ways of interpreting these cultures. And the anthropologist Roy Rappaport refers to these as cognized models. And these can either be positive or negative, or adaptive or maladaptive. So, our model of the environment of ecology can be beneficial. So we could have a sort of like an indigenous cosmology where we live in harmony, in a reciprocal relationship with the natural world, or we could have a destructive model of the environment, perhaps like an industrial model of the environment as a resource to be plundered. So these cultural ecologies can be positive or negative, essentially. Okay, so this is an important point then. And we're beginning to see how cultural ideas, beliefs, and things like that can have an impact on the way that we actually behave in the environment. Another interesting point here, in relation to this idea of spirituality, is the question of religion. And, we have to be careful when we're saying, well, perhaps we can have a spiritual response to the ecological crisis. We need to think about this a little bit more. There's a very famous historian, Lynn White Jr., who put forward the suggestion that the roots of the current ecological crisis that we're going through today can actually be taken back to essentially the ascendancy of Christianity as the kind of dominant paradigm for understanding the world. He says, in antiquity, every tree, every spring, every stream, every hill had its own genius loci, its guardian spirit. These spirits were accessible to humans, but were very unlike centaurs, fauns, and mermaids. Very unlike them. Centaurs, fauns, and mermaids show their ambivalence. Before one cut a tree, mined a mountain, or dammed the brook, it was important to placate the spirit in charge of that particular situation and to keep it placated. By destroying pagan animism, Christianity made it possible to exploit nature in a mood of indifference to the feelings of natural objects. So kind of what he's saying here is that it's actually the loss of this more kind of animistic understanding of the world, of a world of minds and intelligences and spirits, essentially, and a shift away from that to actually demonizing all of that kind of stuff that is the root cause of the problems that we're undergoing today. So, a spiritual orientation, spiritual responses can be, positive or negative as well. So this is the way that I like to think about spiritual orientation. It really helps to show how spirituality and ecology relate to each other, I think. It's taken from the work of David Hay and Rebecca Nye, who did research on children's spirituality. And basically they suggested that, or this is their definition, that spirituality is the potential to be much more deeply aware of ourselves and our intimate relationship with everything that is not ourselves. Okay, so spirituality is our positioning of ourselves in relation to everything else around us and everything that isn't us, other things in the world, the environment around us, other people, how do we relate to that? So this is a very broad and inclusive view of spirituality, which I quite like. And it really suggests that, when we're talking about spirituality, we're talking about how we anchor ourselves in the world and how we understand our place in the world and how we relate to all of this kind of stuff. So if we understand spirituality like this, then it's clear what the relationship is between spirituality and ecology, because our beliefs and experiences about of the world inform the way that we actually act in the world. Okay, and a major contributor to beliefs about the world are experiences. Okay, and sometimes there are extraordinary kinds of experiences that people have. And these extraordinary experiences are relatively common, but are often actually ignored in scholarly discourse. So something that I'm very interested in exploring is the role of these, what we would call paranormal experiences, extraordinary experiences that bring about a shift of perspective for people very often. And I'll just explain why I like the term paranormal, because it's a term that's got a lot of baggage, and but I think actually it's quite a useful term. It was coined initially in the form of the supernormal by F.W.H. Myers, who was a classicist and one of the founders of the Society for Psychical Research in 1882. And he basically suggested this term in order to move what we would today call the paranormal, so experiences of telepathy, clairvoyance, ghosts, and that kind of thing, out of the domain of religion, the realm of the supernatural, and into the domain of science, essentially. So it's a scientific term that was devised to bring these things into the realm of science, not to expel them and push them away, but to be inclusive and bring them into science. So he says that this term supernormal refers to a faculty or phenomenon which goes beyond the level of ordinary experience in the direction of evolution or as pertaining to a transcendent world. The word supernatural is open to grave objections. It assumes that there is something outside nature. Now, there's no reason to suppose that the psychical phenomena with which we deal are less a part of nature. They are above the norm rather than outside nature. So this is the sense in which I use this term paranormal then, is to refer to, natural, normal experiences that people have, okay, that are embedded in the natural world. So, if we understand these experiences from this perspective, then it's it kind of feeds into our understanding of the relationship of ecology and spirituality. Extraordinary experiences change our beliefs, and beliefs impact the way that we behave in the world. Okay, so we've got like a feedback loop thing going on. So yeah, the effect of many paranormal and extraordinary experiences is in fact an enhanced sense of nature connection. And there's plenty of research on this for psychedelic experiences, near-death experiences, alien abductions, all manner of paranormal or extraordinary experiences lead to this effect. So there's something interesting going on here, something interesting to explore. And then one last point that I want to make before moving on to the next part is just thinking about transpersonal psychology as a whole, and just to note that it has actually been quite anthropocentric in its thinking. A lot of thinking in psychology, of course, has been geared towards the human being and how to better human life, obviously, to how to be healthy-minded and all of those kinds of things. And a lot of this is founded on this like Aristotelian idea of eudaimonia, which is usually understood as like human flourishing. Okay, but I think that transpersonal psychology, in fact, this idea of going beyond the personal, should also include, the natural environment around us, the non-human world as well, because you can't have human flourishing, human beings reaching their full potential in an environment that is degraded, destroyed, and not fit for purpose. So I think that there needs to be a slight shift of perspective in transpersonal psychology and in many different disciplines as well, towards considering the non-human, because human flourishing is only possible with ecological flourishing. And we also have in this idea of the transpersonal, the notion of the personal. And this is where we're going to branch into our next section, thinking about the other than human, because for many traditions around the world, the category of personhood, category of the person, includes things that are non-human, Okay, so an important point to bear in mind here as we go forward is that not all persons are necessarily human. So transpersonal psychology should also be able to start considering, the transpersonal dimensions of non-human life as well. So I'm going to explain a little bit why I think this is important with this idea of the other than human. So I think, as I mentioned briefly, this concept comes into our Western discourse through anthropology, but it is essentially an indigenous way of thinking about the world. We get the idea through the work of the American ethnographer Alfred Irving Hallowell, who did work with indigenous North American Ojibwa people. Okay, and he says, I've assembled evidence from my own field work on a branch of the Northern Ojibwa, which supports the inference that in the metaphysics of being found among these Indians, the action of persons provides the major key to their worldview. So for Ojibwa cosmology, the Ojibwa worldview, the world is made up of persons and their relationships with each other. Okay, persons have to live in reciprocal relationships. This work that Hallowell did paved the way for what would become anthropology's ontological turn, which is still kind of ongoing, but also the emergence of what has become known as the new animism, which is a shift away from thinking of animism in terms of primitive mentality and those kind of things that early anthropologists had done, and a move towards thinking of it in terms of an ontology of relationships, okay, of persons living in relationships with each other, and of understanding of how to live in a good relationship with all of the different kinds of persons that make up the environment around us. And this idea is most notably expressed in the work of Graham Harvey. Okay, but here's an interesting example from Hallowell's work of this idea of other than human personhood. So here is Chief Berens, who was one of Hallowell's main informants, and he's sitting next to one of the rocks. Okay, one of these were special rocks, which the Ojibwa considered to be relatives. Okay, so in the Ojibwa language, they're the things that we would refer to as non-animate or inanimate objects, things like rocks, are referred to as grandfathers, as persons. This term mishumis, and it refers to both his genealogical ancestors, his actual great-great-grandfather who put this rock here, as well as to the rocks themselves, which might also be understood as animate grandfathers. Oops. Okay, so this is a little interesting bit that Hallowell says about this. He says his friend had one of these rocks, but he goes on to talk about how these rocks sometimes take on even more what we might think of as paranormal attributes. Okay, so rocks that could actually open their mouths and give out medicine and things like that. So in the Ojibwa worldview, it's possible to have encounters with animate rocks. Their worldview actually leaves that possibility wide open, so that in the event that you do have an experience of that nature, it might come as a surprise, but it can be accommodated. So it's basically saying, and this was something that Hallowell asked. He said, in your worldview, are all the rocks around us alive? And Chief Berens said, only some are. But the chief point is that if they present themselves to you in this way, then they invite your participation. Then you can engage with them in that way as well. So this is, rock personhood is one branch of this issue that we need to consider. And another branch of the issue is plant intelligence. Okay, so, Western science is increasingly showing that plants have got much more going on, behind the scenes than we'd previously given them credit for. There's been a whole load of research recently showing that plants can learn, plants can communicate in different ways that we hadn't considered. And a great book called Brilliant Green by Mancuso and Viola kind of lays out the history of this research. And they say that the study of plant intelligence points up a very interesting aspect of research on intelligence in general, how difficult it is for us humans to understand living systems that think differently from us. Indeed, we only seem able to appreciate intelligences very similar to ours. So again, this is a a representation or a manifestation of that anthropocentrism that we've had in thinking about consciousness and intelligence and spirits. Okay, we've only thought in terms very similar to ourselves in Western science anyway. But they go on to say that a compelling body of research shows that higher order plants really are intelligent, able to receive signals from their environment, process information, devise solutions adaptive to their own survival. What's more, they manifest a kind of swarm intelligence that enables them to behave not as an individual, but as a multitude. So, Western science then is revealing this other dimension to plants, which we might think of as a subjective side of plants, their inner world. Okay, so then we must then, as transpersonal psychologists, also open up to the transpersonal dimension of plants as well. Yeah, we might think of this as their sort of like their ecological self of plants. So plants, rocks even may have this hidden subjective dimension. I mean, panpsychism is increasingly being taken seriously as a possibility. Then they also have a transpersonal dimension. They also have a whole load of other interesting attributes as well, which we might not at first consider. So when we talk about the biological, the ecological crisis that the Earth is going through at the moment, one of the major symptoms that we talk of is biodiversity loss. But obviously this understanding that we're coming to now of plant intelligence and things like that, as well as obviously animal intelligence, animal consciousness, reveals that biodiversity isn't just biomass. Biodiversity is also psychodiversity. It's also minds, it's also consciousness and ways of thinking. So, plant intelligence, Monica Gagliano's fascinating research. And increasingly as well, there's evidence of things that, again, that we'd considered to be purely human characteristics like socially learned culture, but these ideas of culture appearing in non-human animals. All sorts of birds, whales, fish, these are animals that are quite far removed from us and yet are able to do these things that we'd previously thought only humans were capable of doing. So if we begin to understand it from this perspective, it becomes clear that, here's another example as well, bats have got different song cultures. It becomes clear that biomass isn't just organic matter, it's also minds, it's also different ways of thinking, it's also different cultures, different, it's different minds, different consciousness, different psychologies. So, yeah, understood from this perspective, biodiversity crisis is also a psychodiversity crisis. So when you have pronounced cultural differences, between animal species, for example, losing populations is tragic because you're losing these animal cultures that have been built up over many years. They may hold local solutions to specific problems or unique mating preferences not found anywhere. So the point is, that biodiversity is also psychodiversity, and losing biomass is not just a matter of losing, meat essentially. It's also a loss of all of this other stuff. Intangible stuff. Okay, biodiversity is also psychodiversity. So this leads me into the final part of the presentation. We've established what psychodiversity is essentially. If plants, animals, and spirits are persons too, then they also have minds. And this is an idea that's common in many indigenous cosmologies, but it's only recently coming into the fore in the Western cosmology. Okay, so the biodiversity crisis is also a psychodiversity crisis. Western science has recognized the biodiversity crisis, but not so much the psychodiversity crisis, the loss of different ways of living, thinking, and being at an unprecedented rate. We're losing like 50% of species, considered, that's the biodiversity crisis that we're going through at the moment. But, when we think about also the minds that we're losing, that we could potentially, one day study and investigate, or learn about, get to know, never be able to, it's lost. So again, this raises this problem of, or this issue of ecological flourishing. We have a responsibility to restore biodiversity and psychodiversity. Okay, the two go hand in hand. So this is what I think our place can be. You know, now this is a form of subtle activism now, as gardening, a form of fostering psychodiversity and of providing a place for engagement with nature. So I'm kind of borrowing this idea from the work of Julia Wright. She talks about subtle agroecologies. These dealing, as she says, farming with the hidden half of nature. So she says subtle agroecology is not a farming system in itself, but superimposes a non-material dimension upon existing materially based agroecological farming systems. So she's looking at a whole range of different indigenous cosmologies, as well as Western frameworks like Rudolf Steiner's biodynamic farming, for example, which deals with the intelligences of plants and consciousness of plants and that kind of thing. And is basically saying that the thing that makes these explicitly different from like organic farming and things like that is that they do take this spiritual dimension seriously. They do take the transpersonal side of nature into account. Okay, so there are many different systems for engaging with this hidden half of nature. We could think of magical gardening and things like that, for instance. And I'm going to give a couple of little examples. So one could be this idea of philosophical gardens. And the classic example is the Japanese Buddhist Zen garden. These gardens are an expression of Zen philosophy. But in being an expression of that, you know, and in being a garden, in being a place in the world, they also become habitat, don't they, for different animal species. Sean McGovern has argued that these gardens are ways for complex philosophical perceptions and religious ideals to become tangible in topographical text form. So we can read gardens and we can engage with them. And I think there's an interesting point here in terms of like education, that education within gardens for children, you know, in philosophical gardens. Imagine if every school had a philosophical garden. And he goes on to say that Zen gardens can be understood as three-dimensional cones, as puzzles or riddles, often without a solution, that are used to stimulate thought and ultimately contribute towards enlightenment. So the garden can perform a dual function of a spiritual function, maybe more than a dual function, a spiritual function, a teaching function, a biodiversity function, all at the same time. And they can all be, a garden can be an expression of a particular philosophy, or we could use Arnie Ness's term from Deep Ecology of an ecosophy, a philosophy of place. And this is my vegetable patch here, which is I consider it a philosophical garden. It's an expression of my philosophy of understanding of gardening, while also serving biodiversity and psychodiversity. There are also long traditions around the world of using gardens as antechambers to the netherworld, as sort of like ritual spaces where you can go to have interactions with the other than human world. And even in my own fieldwork with mediums in Bristol, you know, all of my fieldwork, and though I wasn't thinking about it in these terms at the time, my experiences with in seances all took place in the garden shed. And we would go through the garden into the shed before having these experiences. And I asked her, the circle leader recently, because I wasn't thinking about it at the time, but I've been thinking about it now, you know, about the role of the garden. And she said that, you know, that it essentially helps to calm people down and to signify moving into a sacred space, essentially. So the garden performs that function as well. The ancient Greeks worshipped in groves, for instance, in sacred spaces. Assyrians and Egyptians had gardens that were all planted according to the gods, essentially. Certain plants would be associated with certain gods. So you would have certain areas in the garden that were dedicated to certain deities. So there's this relationship there between not only the spiritual dimension of the deities, but also the biological level of the plants. And I like this idea that we can think of gardens as hybrid places, or as halfway places between the human world and the spiritual world or the natural world, or between the wild and the domesticated. So gardens become a liminal zone where interactions and where dialogue can take place. And there's lots of interesting anthropological work on various different kinds of gardens and the kinds of magic that you have to do in gardens in order to protect yourself in these liminal places, because liminal places are, places where spirits can come through. So there's a lot of interesting stuff here that needs to be unpacked further, really. And just another interesting point to add on here is that the fairy census, which was published a few years ago, now reveals actually quite a surprisingly high proportion of fairy experiences taking place in either garden or woodland areas. So, there's an interesting thing here to do with extraordinary experiences and engagement and participation in gardens or in these hybrid places where humans can go to interact with nature. Another way that we might be able to incorporate this into a form of, subtle activism might be through examples like this of spirit houses in Thailand, which can be understood as a way of establishing a relationship with subtle ecological elements. So these houses, they're all over the place in Thailand, and they basically serve the function of reminding people in these places that these are essentially inhabited places, that spirits live here. So they become a kind of a point of dialogue. I'll just read this out. The ornate shrines which adorn many house compounds in contemporary urban Thailand tie into local understandings of the social character of places. It's suggested that the persistence of spirit houses can be partly understood through their roles as mediators of the phenomenological experience of certain places. Spirit houses are one part of a gathering process that imbues places with significant meaning. The shrines exemplify that culturally specific interactions and engagements with spirits associated with certain places influence how the phenomenological qualities of these places are constructed and experienced. So they serve as a reminder of the inhabited, or we could say haunted, nature of place, and invite us into a dialogue or a relationship with that. Okay, so there are similar ideas around the world, and these elf houses in Iceland are one of the classic examples, of these little markers for the hidden folk. But what I love about these is that they're also essentially, like bug hotels, and they create habitat, and they become a part of the landscape, biodiverse, they become, full of insects and whatever, and they become, biodiverse and psychodiverse at the same time. They become filled with consciousness and mind. And here's just a nice image of the Ethiopian forest churches, where we've got pretty much agricultural desert land around here. And then the sanctuary of the church of the spiritual place and of the trees is all that has protected this small oasis of wilderness in the desert. Okay, so again, it's just thinking about this relationship between spiritual orientation and biodiversity. And I just want to finish with this little quote that I found while I've been doing a lot of research on Welsh fairy traditions recently. And I found this little quote that directly links the transpersonal realm of the fairies to the nuts and bolts realm of biology and ecology. Okay, so folklore contains ample models of this subtle understanding of landscape and action. It also reveals a close association between biodiversity and psychodiversity. So this is from an article about Welsh fairies. At the very beginning of the article, he says, the bees of 50 years ago, and he's writing in 1929, so he's talking about the bees of the 1800s, like the fairies, have been banished from Wales. And I sometimes feel that with their departure, there has been some loss both of hope and of sweetness in life. When you begin to talk about fairies, you must begin with the bees, for they are the messengers of the fairies and will lead you to them and their habitats. Okay, so we've got here very nicely kind of encapsulated this relationship between the fairies, the spiritual realm, and the biological realm, the ecological realm. And actually the two are intertwined. And if you lose your biodiversity, you also lose the fairies. Okay, so here's my conclusions then. Ecology and spirituality are deeply interconnected. Our outlook on the world and the different ways that we behave within it are informed by our spiritual orientation. Our spiritual orientation is often influenced by personal experience, as well as cultural learning, which can include paranormal, extraordinary, and transpersonal experiences. And these experiences often bring about quite sudden changes as well. Transpersonal psychology is often operated under an anthropocentric assumption, e.g. this idea of human flourishing or eudaimonia. But what about ecological flourishing, without which there is no human flourishing? Indigenous knowledge systems see personhood as a fundamental category and constituent of the world. So the world is made up of persons, not all of whom are human. Western science is increasingly revealing that consciousness and intelligence is more widely distributed throughout nature than we've previously given it credit for, at least within Western science, and that there is plant intelligence and non-human cultures and all of these kind of things, which means that biodiversity is also psychodiversity. It's not just biomass and meat, it's also consciousness, mind, culture. So we can help to promote both biodiversity and psychodiversity with forms of subtle agroecological activism, philosophical gardening, sacred gardening, magical gardening, or even just rewilding, even just planting plants. If indeed plants do have this subtle hidden dimension to them, then having an abundant garden is having a sacred, biodiverse, psychodiverse place. And finally, what we want to be doing is to enable mind in nature to express itself fully. And that's human minds, of course, but also all of the other various different forms of mind that exist in nature. So that's it. Here's a few references, and thank you very much.